The lights were hot, the room electric, and every camera lens was locked onto the stage. Tim Scott leaned forward, voice rising with each word as though volume alone could crush his opponent. His words came fast, sharp, and unrelenting. Accusations hurled like stones, interruptions slicing through the air before Jasmine Crockett could even finish a breath. It was less debate than domination attempt, and Scott thrived in that storm of his own making. The audience reacted in waves, gasps when his tone cut too harsh, murmurs when his finger jabbed the air, uneasy glances when his voice cracked with anger. For Scott, this was the moment to seize control, to remind everyone of his power. His voice thundered across the stage, demanding obedience, demanding silence from the woman who sat across from him. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. While Scott's face flushed with the strain of his outburst, Crockett sat steady, her eyes fixed on him with the quiet force of someone who had weathered storms far fiercer than a raised voice. She did not frown, did not roll her eyes, did not match his volume. Instead, she allowed his noise to fill the hall like a passing siren, loud, alarming, but destined to fade. That contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side of the stage, chaos, aggression, desperation dressed up as strength. On the other, calm, dignity, and an unshaken sense of purpose. The crowd, once caught in the turbulence of Scott's shouting, began to shift. A few heads turned toward Crockett, curious to see how long she could sit there in silence. Others leaned in, waiting for the inevitable eruption, the counterattack, the equal return of fire. But it never came. Not yet. Crockett's silence was louder than his fury, and with each passing second, the imbalance grew more striking. He was noise, she was stillness. He was heat, she was steel. And then at the precise moment when Scott believed he had finally drowned her out, Jasmine Crockett leaned ever so slightly toward her microphone. The audience froze. The cameras zoomed in. Even Scott paused mid-sentence, realizing too late that the silence was about to break. But no one expected what she said next. A line that left Tim Scott utterly speechless. This was never just about two politicians sparring on stage. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like another fiery exchange in a long line of televised debates. But beneath the lights, beneath the sound bites, something deeper was at play. This was a clash of visions for America, and every word, every pause carried the weight of history. Tim Scott came into the arena embodying a brand of establishment conservatism that thrives on performance. His rhetoric was polished, his anger strategic, his interruptions carefully aimed at drawing applause from a certain corner of the audience. He wasn't speaking to Crockett. He was performing for those who have long rewarded bluster over substance. To them, his raised voice sounded like strength. To them, domination looked like leadership. And Scott was more than willing to play that part, even if it meant shouting down dignity in the process. But Jasmine Crockett represented something else entirely. She was not polished for theatrics. She was not fueled by the shallow adrenaline of applause lines. She carried with her the weight of communities who rarely saw themselves represented with respect. She spoke for those silenced by poverty, for those dismissed because of race or gender, for those told that their voice didn't matter in the halls of power. To sit calm in the face of Scott's fury was not weakness. It was resistance. It was a refusal to bend to a system that measured worth by who could shout the loudest. And this is where the stakes grew clearer with every passing second. The room wasn't just witnessing a disagreement, it was watching two Americas collide. One America, clinging to noise, to spectacle, to the idea that power is proven by drowning others out. And another America, rising through the calm, through the quiet strength of those who have endured far worse than a raised voice. This wasn't just Crockett defending herself. It was dignity standing its ground against arrogance. It was truth refusing to bow before theatre, and the crowd felt that shift. At first they reacted to Scott's loudness, the jabs, the sharp edges, the sheer force of his tone. But as Crockett's silence stretched on, something in the room began to change. The audience leaned in, realizing they were witnessing more than noise. They were watching the strength it takes to endure without breaking, the courage it takes to wait until the right moment to speak. For Scott, every raised decibel felt like victory. Every interruption was in his mind a point scored. But for those watching, in the audience, online, across the country, his performance was beginning to look less like dominance and more like desperation. Crockett's composure reframed the entire clash. She wasn't the one under attack. He was the one unraveling, and everyone could see it. Because power isn't proven in the storm. It's proven in who can stand steady when the storm rages loudest. And every time Tim Scott raised his voice, he thought he was winning. But the audience was seeing something else unfold. Tim Scott has long been seen as a polished figure in conservative politics, a man with a carefully crafted image designed to appeal to both the establishment and the grassroots. On paper, his rise looks like a story of discipline and determination. The son of a working-class family who climbed into the Senate, marketed as proof that anyone can succeed within the system if they simply work hard enough. He speaks in measured cadences when the cameras are rolling, delivering lines that sound uplifting, polished, even inspiring. To many, he projects stability and optimism, a safe face for conservatism in a time of chaos. But beneath that polish lies a very different reality. Scott has mastered the art of contradiction, speaking about unity while practicing division, promoting civility while interrupting and belittling those who challenge him, framing himself as calm and rational while leaning into the theatrics of outrage when it serves his ambition. His career has been built not just on what he says, but on how loudly he can say it when the spotlight burns hottest. Over the years, Scott has learned a powerful trick: to drown out his opponents by speaking over them, not necessarily with substance, but with volume, rhythm, and certainty. He knows that in a world where debates are cut into sound bites and clips, dominance is often mistaken for truth. His strategy has been simple but effective: overwhelm the space, leave no silence, and project confidence so forcefully that even shaky arguments feel unshakable. And arrogance has followed him every step of the way. He has believed, time and again, that his ability to outtalk his adversaries meant that he was outsmarting them. When challenged, he defaults to performance, interrupting, raising his voice, layering his speech with absolute conviction, even when the facts waver beneath the surface. To his supporters, it looks like strength. To his critics, it reeks of insecurity disguised as confidence. That contradiction has defined him. Scott presents himself as a unifier, but his actions often mirror the very politics of division he claims to reject. He tells stories of resilience, yet uses that narrative as a weapon to dismiss those who point out systemic inequality. He insists on respect, yet gives little of it when confronted by those who refuse to yield. In essence, he has built a career on projecting dignity outward, while often undermining it in practice. The stage has always been his chosen battleground. From Senate hearings to television debates, Scott thrives on the moment when the lights are glaring and the cameras are rolling. It is there that his tactic of controlled aggression, of verbal flood and sharp interruption, finds its home. He leans into the belief that Americans reward confidence above all else, that looking like you're in control matters more than actually being right. But history is littered with figures who believed that volume could protect them from vulnerability. And in that history, arrogance has always met its match, because volume eventually exposes itself. The louder someone grows, the more it reveals. Not strength, but fear of silence. Not certainty, but fear of being truly challenged. And on that stage with Jasmine Crockett, Scott walked into the very trap arrogance sets for itself. He mistook interruption for dominance. He mistook loudness for power. He mistook performance for truth. What he did not realize was that Crockett, calm and steady, was letting him write his own downfall in real time. Because the audience wasn't just hearing his words, they were watching the unraveling of his performance. They were beginning to see past the polish, past the cadence, past the carefully rehearsed pauses. They were beginning to see the cracks that arrogance always leaves behind. Scott had spent a career believing that no one could match his strategy of overwhelming the moment. But history has always delivered a lesson to men who mistake noise for strength. Silence has a power of its own. And when wielded by someone who understands patience, silence can slice sharper than the loudest shout. Tim Scott thought he was the one in control, but what he didn't yet know was this: arrogance always believes it is invincible until the moment it collides with dignity. And history shows us, arrogance always meets its match. To understand why Jasmine Crockett stood unshaken under Tim Scott's barrage, you have to know where she came from. Because Crockett's story is not one of privilege or shortcuts. It's one of grit, resilience, and the quiet strength that only comes from living through storms most politicians never even have to weather. She didn't grow up with power handed to her. She carved her way into it, step by step, carrying with her the weight of communities that are too often ignored. Long before the cameras, before the stage lights, she was a lawyer fighting in the trenches, representing people who couldn't afford expensive counsel, standing for those who had no other voice in the courtroom. She faced off against systems designed to break ordinary people, and she didn't back down. Each case, each client, each uphill battle hardened her resolve. The lessons she learned there became her armor. And that armor wasn't forged in silence. It was forged in confrontation, but not the loud, theatrical kind that Tim Scott thrives on. Crockett's kind of confrontation is about persistence. It's about refusing to move even when the weight of the world pushes down. It's about showing up, again and again, when others would have long since walked away. When she entered politics, she carried those same instincts with her. She didn't come to play the polished game of pleasing donors and crafting safe talking points. She came to represent real people, working-class families, marginalized voices, communities tired of being told to wait their turn. In every campaign, in every speech, Crockett carried herself with a rawness that wasn't scripted but lived. She didn't need to manufacture authenticity. It was in her bones. And authenticity in today's America is revolutionary. Because when so many in power are trained to disguise themselves, Crockett's refusal to hide who she is made her a target, but also made her unstoppable. Her identity as a black woman in politics wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. She carried with her the weight of generations who had been told they didn't belong, who had been shouted down, dismissed, and erased. Every step forward she took wasn't just for herself. It was for them. That's why dignity has always been her greatest weapon. Not because she avoids conflict, but because she refuses to let others define the terms of it. When others scream, she steadies her voice. When others insult, she raises the level of discourse. When others try to drag her down into the mud, she answers with a reminder of who she is and who she represents. Her calm is not weakness, it's strategy. And it's a strategy honed over years of being underestimated. You see, Crockett has faced worse than Tim Scott's shouting. She has faced the sting of doors slammed in her face, the frustration of watching her community's concerns brushed aside, the exhaustion of being told that her time would come later, if at all. Yet each of those moments became fuel. They taught her to withstand heat, to transform frustration into clarity, and to hold her ground even when every force around her demanded that she move. By the time she stood on that stage across from Tim Scott, she wasn't just a politician defending herself. She was a living testament to survival and progress. She carried the scars of struggle, but she wore them like medals of honor. Every word she spoke came not just from intellect, but from experience. And that kind of truth, lived truth, has a power louder than any raised voice. So when Scott came swinging with his polished barbs, his loud interruptions, his overconfidence sharpened by years of unchecked arrogance, Crockett didn't flinch. She had been shouted at before. She had been dismissed before. She had been underestimated before. This moment was not new to her. It was familiar territory, and that familiarity was her advantage. Because while Scott believed his aggression would shake her, it only confirmed what she already knew. Men like him mistake loudness for leadership. Men like him believe that by dominating the air, they dominate the narrative. But Crockett understood something deeper. The people watching weren't just listening to his words. They were watching his behavior. They were comparing his noise to her poise. And in that contrast, truth was writing itself. Crockett's calm wasn't passive. It was defiant. It was a reminder that dignity can outlast chaos, that strength doesn't need to shout to be heard. And it was in that silence between his words, that silence she commanded by refusing to take his bait, where her true power lived. So when Tim Scott leaned in with insults, when he thought he was cutting her down, Crockett stood taller. Her journey had prepared her for this exact moment. Her resilience had sharpened her. Her identity had armed her. Her community was with her, not just in spirit, but in every breath she took on that stage. And that's why when the time came, When the noise grew unbearable and the tension reached its breaking point, Jasmine Crockett didn't waver. She was ready. She was prepared to deliver a line that would change the entire night. The stage was no longer neutral ground. What began as an exchange of ideas was now a battlefield, and Tim Scott wielded his voice like a weapon. He cut in before Crockett could finish her sentences, layering interruptions over her words like bricks in a wall, hoping to bury her beneath the weight of his aggression. His tone sharpened with each remark, his volume climbing higher as if sheer decibels could substitute for truth. "Answer the question," he barked. "Don't dodge. Don't spin." His finger jabbed the air as though to puncture her composure. Every pause she tried to take became an opening for him to barrel through. His strategy was clear. Overwhelm her, force her off balance, leave her scrambling for footing. But Jasmine Crockett did not scramble. She sat steady, her eyes locked on him, her breathing calm, her silence deliberate. The more he raged, the less she moved. She didn't fidget. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply waited, the corners of her mouth tightening just enough to signal restraint, not defeat. It was as though she understood something he did not, that sometimes silence is louder than shouting. The crowd felt it too. At first there were murmurs, uneasy laughter when Scott's interruptions piled one over another, but soon the restlessness shifted. People leaned forward in their seats, not to hear him, but to see how she would respond. His words became a blur, a string of noise blending into itself, while her stillness became the focal point. Every moment she didn't break added to the tension, like a bowstring pulled tighter and tighter, waiting to snap. Scott, blinded by his own momentum, mistook the crowd's shifting energy for support. He grew bolder, his voice rising until it thundered across the stage. He layered accusation upon accusation, painting himself as the sole truth-teller. But in doing so, he failed to notice the impatience growing in the room, not with Crockett, but with him. And still, she waited. Her patience wasn't passivity. It was a calculated choice, one honed through years of battles where noise was designed to drown her out. She knew the value of timing. She knew the power of letting arrogance expose itself, of letting the villain write his own downfall with every unchecked word. By now, even the moderators were shifting uncomfortably, their attempts to restore balance drowned out by Scott's dominance. Yet Crockett did not plead for space. She didn't demand fairness. Instead, she prepared. The audience could see it in her eyes. The quiet fire, the subtle inhale, the faintest lean forward, as though she was storing every ounce of energy for one decisive moment. The escalation reached its peak when Scott, flushed and unrelenting, tried one final swing. His words, meant to sting, landed heavy in the room. But instead of delivering the knockout blow he envisioned, his outburst left the air thick with anticipation. Because everyone, from the front row to the rafters, was no longer listening to him. They were waiting for her. Jasmine Crockett, poised and deliberate, let the silence stretch. She gave the audience a beat to feel the weight of his words. And then, just as the tension threatened to snap, she leaned ever so slightly toward the microphone. The room held its breath. And then she began. The silence before her voice carried was almost unbearable. The audience leaned in, some holding their breath, others gripping the edges of their seats. Tim Scott's words still hung in the air, loud and jagged, but already fading into something hollow. Then came the sound that shifted everything. Jasmine Crockett's voice, measured, steady, and unshaken. She began not with fire, but with restraint. "Senator," she said softly, her tone like cool water poured over the embers of his rage, "I let you finish every word, though none of them carried the truth. Now, if you're ready to hear it, I'll tell you what the people already know." The words landed like a gavel strike. The audience exhaled in unison, stunned by her composure. Scott shifted in his chair, his mouth half open, prepared to interject again. But this time, Crockett raised a single hand, not in defiance, not in anger, but in command. And the room obeyed her. He froze, and so did the crowd. "Noise," she continued, her gaze fixed squarely on him, "is not power. Shouting over someone doesn't make your point stronger, it makes it weaker, and what you've shown here tonight is not strength, it's fear disguised as volume." Gasps rippled through the room. Some in the audience looked at one another, eyebrows raised, as though confirming they had all just heard the same thing. Scott's face tightened, but before he could recover, Crockett pressed on. "You speak about truth," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "But truth doesn't need to be shouted. Truth is steady. Truth is clear. Truth doesn't tremble when the room gets loud. And I sit here, calm, not because I don't have words, but because I know when to use them. Unlike you, Senator, I don't confuse interruptions with intelligence." The line sliced through the noise like a blade. Laughter burst from the crowd, not raucous but sharp, cathartic. Scott leaned forward, flustered, his hands gripping the desk, as though holding on to the last shreds of control. Crockett's tone, however, never shifted. She spoke with the patience of someone who had endured this performance before, who had seen the same tactic countless times. "You've made a career out of talking over people who look like me, people you thought would shrink when confronted. But let me tell you something. Every word you tried to bury here tonight only lifted me higher. Because dignity doesn't bow to arrogance, and identity doesn't break under noise." The audience erupted, a mix of applause and cheers, the energy swelling in the room like a wave. Scott opened his mouth again, but the sound caught in his throat. He blinked, stunned, his timing shattered. For the first time in this debate, and perhaps in his career, his voice failed him, and Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned in just enough for the microphone to capture the quiet power of her next words. "You think interruption is victory, but interruption is desperation. You think raising your voice makes you heard. But let me tell you, the louder you yell, the clearer it becomes that you've got nothing left to say." The room roared, and still she didn't raise her own voice. Her calm was the contrast, the anchor, the undeniable proof that power doesn't always come with volume. She paused, letting the applause crest and fade, then delivered the line that left the audience breathless. "I don't need to shout, Senator, because when truth stands tall, it speaks for itself." The silence that followed was electric. Every face in the room turned to Scott, waiting for him to answer, to reclaim the dominance he had boasted with so many words before. But his lips parted and closed without sound, his eyes darting as though searching for a script that had suddenly vanished. Crockett sat back, her hands folded, her expression serene. She had said what she needed to say, and she knew it was enough. The audience knew it too. The moment belonged to her, and there was no undoing it. Scott cleared his throat, fumbling for a retort, but his hesitation betrayed him. His rhythm was broken, his bluster gone. He stammered a few half-formed words before trailing off into silence. The weight of her clapback pressing down on him harder than any argument he had attempted. And that was when it hit everyone. The imbalance was complete. His chaos had collapsed under her composure. His noise had been swallowed by her dignity. The battle was over, though no one had declared it. The crowd rose to its feet, some clapping, some shaking their heads in awe. The sound of their reaction was not the wild cheer of a spectacle, but the solemn thunder of recognition. They had just witnessed something more than debate. They had witnessed a turning point. Scott sat back, lips tight, eyes avoiding hers. For once, his voice, the tool he had relied on for so long, deserted him. And Jasmine Crockett, calm and unflinching, had proved that silence, when timed with precision, could be louder than the fiercest scream. And what happened after that made the moment unforgettable. The moment the debate ended, it was as if a lightning bolt had struck the national stage. Within minutes, newsrooms scrambled to the clip, anchors huddled with producers, and every chyron across America carried the same image. Tim Scott, frozen mid-sentence, his voice caught in his throat, while Jasmine Crockett sat calm and unshaken. The networks replayed the exchange on loop, analysts dissecting each line, each pause, each flicker of expression on Scott's face. One commentator said it bluntly on primetime. This wasn't just a takedown. This was a dismantling. Crockett exposed what happens when noise meets truth. Another called it a masterclass in composure under fire. And yet another remarked, "For years we've watched Tim Scott talk over opponents, but tonight he met someone who refused to be drowned out, and the silence was his undoing." But the real shockwaves weren't confined to television. Social media lit up like a wildfire. The hashtag Calm Clapback shot to #1 within the hour. Memes flooded every corner of Twitter, TikTok and Instagram. Scott's stunned expression became a template for captions like, "When you realize the Wi-Fi isn't free," or "When the teacher actually calls on you." The internet was ruthless, but it was also celebratory. Crockett's line, "Noise is not power. Truth doesn't tremble when the room gets loud," was clipped, captioned, and shared millions of times. TikTok creators stitched it into motivational edits. College students blasted it at rallies. Activists quoted it on posters. Even late-night comedians got in on it, dubbing Scott's silence as the loudest quiet of his career. Supporters saw it as validation, a rare moment when dignity outshined arrogance in real time. One viral tweet read, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended every voice that's ever been shouted down." Another user posted, "This is bigger than politics. This is what grace under pressure looks like." Even critics, reluctant to give her credit, couldn't ignore what had happened. Conservative pundits tried to spin the exchange as grandstanding, but their arguments fell flat against the sheer weight of the clip replaying across platforms. One right-leaning host sighed on air, "I'll be honest, Tim Scott got outplayed. No question about it." For Scott, the aftermath was brutal. His silence became the story, his stumble immortalized in headlines like "The night Team Scott had no words" and "Crockett leaves Senator speechless." Cartoonists sketched him clutching a broken microphone, his once booming voice reduced to a whisper. In political circles, whispers grew louder. Had his image as a polished debater taken a fatal hit? But for Crockett, the moment wasn't just about a viral soundbite. It was about what it represented, a shift. People who had felt ignored, shouted over, dismissed, suddenly saw themselves in her calm defiance. They shared the clip not just as entertainment, but as empowerment. Churches played it in Sunday sermons. Grassroots groups used it as a rallying cry. For many, it wasn't just politics, it was personal. One young activist posted a video with tears in her eyes. "Watching Crockett stand tall while he tried to talk her down, I felt like she was standing for all of us. For every time I've been silenced, for every time I've been told to wait my turn. Tonight, she showed us we don't have to wait anymore." The energy spilled into the streets. At a rally in Houston, signs read, "Truth over noise" and "Dignity wins." Crowds chanted Crockett's words like a chorus. What began as a single moment in a debate had transformed into a cultural spark, igniting conversations far beyond the stage. Yet underneath the memes, the laughter, and the celebration, there was something deeper at play. This wasn't just a takedown. It was a mirror held up to American politics, showing the hunger for leaders who don't just shout, but who stand firm, who carry themselves with unshakable dignity, even when under attack. And as the clip continued to circulate, one question lingered in the air. Had Jasmine Crockett's calm reply shifted more than just the mood of a debate? Had she shifted the conversation about what leadership in America could look like? Because beyond the viral clip, the lesson was even bigger. As the dust settled from the viral storm, one truth began to rise above the noise. Jasmine Crockett's composure had not only silenced a rival, it had redefined the meaning of strength in the public arena. In a culture where shouting often overshadows substance, her calmness became the loudest statement of all. Commentators tried to replay the debate like a boxing match, round after round, blow by blow. But when the final bell rang, it wasn't the volume of Tim Scott's voice that people remembered. It was the unshaken dignity of Crockett. She didn't win by force. She won by refusing to be dragged into chaos, by letting truth sit taller than arrogance. And in that victory, something universal came to life. It was a reminder that dignity outlasts disruption, that patience is not weakness but power, that justice doesn't need to scream to be heard. The very stillness of her response became a force stronger than any insult hurled her way. Across the nation, people began to see themselves in her calm reply. The worker ignored in boardrooms, the immigrant dismissed at city halls. The young activist told their voice was too small, too unpolished, too inconvenient. Crockett's moment was their vindication. It was proof that when the world gets loud, the quiet strength of dignity can turn silence into a victory louder than thunder. Her clapback was more than a debate point. It was a mirror held up to America, asking, what kind of leadership do we honor? The ones who shout the loudest, or the ones who stand firm when the shouting begins? Crockett's stance answered that question without needing to pound the table. Her presence itself was the answer, and in that presence there was pride. Pride in identity, pride in history, pride in carrying forward the voices of those who had been silenced before. Crockett showed that true representation isn't about playing by the old rules of domination. It's about rewriting them with courage and grace. Even her critics, even those who would never cast a vote her way, had to admit what they had seen. Composure disarming aggression, calm dismantling fury. And that image carried weight beyond party lines. It carried the weight of a truth too obvious to deny, that real leadership is measured not by how loud you speak, but by how steady you remain when others try to shake you. So when her words echoed, "Noise is not power. Truth doesn't tremble when the room gets loud," they didn't fade when the microphones turned off. They lingered. They became a mantra, a rallying cry, a reminder etched into the collective memory of all who witnessed it. Because in that clash, Crockett reframed the rules. She showed that silence, when filled with strength, can be more commanding than shouting. She proved that dignity is not passive. It is active, it is defiant, it is enduring. And she taught America that the greatest weapon against chaos is composure rooted in truth. This was the moral that resonated beyond politics. It was the lesson parents shared with their children, the story teachers told in classrooms, the line community leaders repeated in churches, mosques, and community halls. It became bigger than a single debate, bigger than two names on a stage. It became a parable for our time, because when dignity rises, no scream and no attack can bury it. Tim Scott came in swinging, armed with volume and bravado. Jasmine Crockett met him with calm, with dignity, with the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. And in the end, it wasn't his attack that people remembered. It was her clapback, sharp, steady, unforgettable. A moment that turned the noise of arrogance into the silence of defeat. This is the lesson the night gave us. Truth is stronger than bluster. Dignity outlasts disruption, and composure can silence chaos. Crockett proved that leadership isn't measured in decibels, it's measured in resolve, in grace under fire, in refusing to shrink when the spotlight turns harsh. And as the clip of that exchange spreads across feeds, across timelines, across dinner tables, it carries more than entertainment. It carries a message, one that belongs to every worker overlooked, every immigrant dismissed, every citizen told to stay quiet. It says your calm, your dignity, your truth is power. But here's the thing. Moments like this don't just need to be remembered, they need to be amplified. They need to ripple wider, reach further, inspire deeper. That's where you come in. Share this story. Subscribe to stay connected to Voices That Matter. Be part of the movement that lifts up leaders who carry communities, not just egos. Because what unfolded on that stage wasn't just politics. It wasn't just a clash of two names, two microphones. It was history. History reminding us that dignity doesn't just survive the storm, it defines it. And history like this is too important to whisper about. It deserves to be shouted, shared, and carried forward. This wasn't just politics. It was history unfolding before our eyes.